The Last Train to Nowhere, Episode 3. Mia blinked, her vision blurred as she woke up. The air was cold, too cold for what should have been an enclosed space. But they weren't inside anymore. The rough, damp ground beneath her hands told her as much. Slowly, she pushed herself up, her mind sluggishly grasping at what had happened. The others were stirring nearby. Liam was already sitting up, rubbing his temples. Grace hugged her knees, staring wide-eyed into the thick fog that clung to them like a suffocating blanket. Jason stood off to the side, his fists clenched, his gaze darting nervously from one shadow to the next. They weren't in the small building anymore, the one they had barricaded themselves inside. Instead, they were back on the streets of the town, or at least it looked like the town. Except, something had changed. I don't remember leaving, Mia muttered, her voice shaky. She looked around, her breath catching. The street was unfamiliar, and yet, we didn't leave. Liam replied quietly. He stood, brushing the dirt off his suit. This place, it's shifting. Every time we close our eyes, it's like it moves. Mia's stomach twisted. She stared ahead. The street, something about it was wrong. It was empty, desolate, like the rest of the town. But now, in the distance, there was a sign, a cafe. Her breath hitched. It couldn't be. The others hadn't noticed it yet. But Mia couldn't tear her eyes away. The sign, the name. It was a place she hadn't seen in years. A cafe from her hometown where she used to meet Chris, her ex, the one she had run from. Her heart pounded. This wasn't just any town anymore. It was pulling pieces of their past into it. And that meant whatever was next might be worse. Jason hadn't said a word since they had woken up in the new part of town. He stayed at the edge of the group, his shoulders hunched, jaw clenched. Mia watched him, noting how he kept looking away, as if trying to hide something. They kept moving, cautiously, through the shifting streets, but Jason kept falling behind. Mia slowed her pace, staying near him. "You all right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason didn't answer immediately. He rubbed his face, clearly agitated, before finally glancing at her. "It's nothing," he muttered. "Just memories." Mia frowned. "What kind of memories?" Jason stopped walking, his fists trembling at his sides. "Bad ones," he finally said. "Stuff I don't talk about." She didn't push him further, but as they continued walking, Mia noticed Jason's eyes darting to the sides, as if he was seeing something none of them could. In the fog, shadows shifted. At first, Mia thought it was just her mind playing tricks, but then she saw it, a faint outline, a figure moving through the mist. No, not just a figure. It was Jason, a younger version of him, his hands covered in a red liquid, his face twisted with regret. Jason stopped dead in his tracks, staring into the mist, frozen. His own shadowy reflection stood there, reenacting something from his past. Something terrible. "Jason," Mia whispered. He didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the vision, and the shadows swallowed him whole. Grace had been quiet the entire time, her eyes constantly scanning the fog. Mia couldn't blame her. After what they had all seen, what they had felt, it was impossible to ignore the weight pressing down on them. But Grace was trembling more than the others. Her breath came in short, uneven bursts, and her fingers dug into her arms as if trying to ground herself. "Grace?" Evelyn's voice was soft, but it carried. "What's wrong?" Grace looked at her, her eyes brimming with tears. She shook her head as if denying the question, but something cracked in her expression. "I keep hearing her," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who?" Mia asked gently, stepping closer. "My friend," Grace said, her voice breaking. She died, and I hear her in the fog calling my name." Evelyn stepped forward, her eyes soft with understanding. "It wasn't your fault." Grace shook her head harder, tears spilling over now. "It was. I should have stopped her. I should have said something. I could have." Before she could finish, the fog shifted again, and this time they all heard it, a faint voice drifting through the mist, calling Grace's name. It was soft, eerie, and unmistakably familiar to her. "Grace," the voice echoed. Grace's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the cold ground, sobbing. Mia rushed to her side, but before she could offer comfort, the faceless figures appeared in the fog once more, as if drawn to Grace's despair. As they moved through the eerie streets, it became clear that the town wasn't just a backdrop. It was alive. Every step they took seemed to warp the environment around them, like the fog itself was controlling the landscape. The streets bent and twisted as if they were being funneled somewhere, each building's shape subtly shifting when no one was watching. Liam stumbled ahead, breathing heavily, his eyes darting nervously from one distorted alley to the next. "This isn't right," he muttered, breaking the silence. "None of this is right." Mia glanced around, her skin crawling with unease. Then, in the corner of her vision, something flickered. She stopped abruptly, her heart pounding as she stared at the small cafe that had suddenly appeared through the mist. It looked so familiar, too familiar. The neon sign above the door glowed faintly through the fog, the letters spelling out the name of a cafe she used to visit, back when she was still with Chris. She hadn't set foot in that place for years, not since things with Chris had gone from bad to worse. Her breath caught in her throat. This town was no longer just strange, it was personal. Liam, now a few feet ahead, froze. His face paled as he gazed upward at the tall building that had emerged from the fog. It was a sleek, modern office tower, completely out of place in the decaying town. That's the building where it all fell apart," he whispered, his voice trembling, "where I lost everything." The group stopped in their tracks, each of them seeing something new, yet impossibly familiar. Jason clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. In the distance, Mia could see the flickering shadows of his past trailing him, always just out of focus but undeniably real. He was being haunted, not just by the faceless figures, but by his own mistakes. "This isn't just a town," Mia whispered, her voice shaking. "It's showing us everything we've been trying to forget." Grace shuddered beside her, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. "It's using our memories," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's pulling them out, showing us what we've been running from." The fog thickened around them, swirling like smoke, and as they continued walking, more familiar buildings appeared. The town was no longer just a nightmare. It was a reflection of everything they feared, everything they regretted. The air felt suffocating, as though the weight of their pasts was pressing down on them, forcing them to confront the memories they'd buried deep inside. They moved in silence, each step heavier than the last, as the town continued to warp and twist around them. They were trapped in a maze of their own regrets, and there was no way out. Evelyn had been walking in a daze, her hand never leaving the locket around her neck. Her steps were slow, measured, as if each one was taking her deeper into her own memories. The others were focused on the shifting town, but Mia noticed that Evelyn had fallen behind. She turned back, her heart sinking as she saw the look on the older woman's face. Evelyn was staring ahead, her eyes wide and filled with something Mia hadn't seen in her before. Hope mixed with devastation. "Evelyn?" Mia called softly, stepping closer. But Evelyn didn't respond. Her gaze was locked on a figure in the distance, standing just beyond the edge of the fog. The shape was blurry, but it was unmistakably human. A young man, standing impossibly still, his features obscured by the swirling mist. Mia squinted, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, and then it hit her. "Is that?" Mia whispered, her voice trailing off. "It's Mark," Evelyn murmured, her voice so faint that Mia could barely hear her. Tears welled up in her eyes as she took a step toward the figure. "It's my son." Mia's heart sank. She had heard Evelyn talk about her son before, how he had died in a car accident, how she had never forgiven herself for not being there when he needed her. But this couldn't be real. "Evelyn, it's not him. It's this place. It's playing tricks on us." But Evelyn didn't seem to hear her. She took another step forward, her hand reaching out as if she could touch the figure standing in the fog. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." The others had stopped now, their eyes on Evelyn as she moved closer to the figure. Grace wrapped her arms around herself, tears streaming down her face. Liam shook his head, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. "Evelyn, stop," Liam said, stepping forward, but he didn't dare get too close to the figure. "It's not him. It can't be." But Evelyn wasn't listening. Her entire body shook as she reached out toward the mist, her fingers trembling. "I can fix this," she whispered. "I can make it right." Just as her hand was about to touch the figure, it vanished, swallowed up by the fog. Evelyn collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps as sobs tore through her. Mia rushed to her side, wrapping an arm around her trembling form. The others stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what had just happened. "He's gone," Evelyn whispered, her voice broken. "He's gone, and I can't bring him back." Mia held her tighter, her own heart breaking. They had all lost something, someone, but this place, it was exploiting that pain, using it against them, and Evelyn was slipping deeper into it, unable to pull herself free. The group moved in silence after that, Evelyn's sobs the only sound echoing through the fog. The weight of what they had just witnessed hung heavy in the air, an oppressive force that seemed to press down on them with every step. Mia's heart raced, her mind spinning as she tried to make sense of the town's twisted game. It wasn't just showing them memories, it was pulling them in, forcing them to relive the worst moments of their lives. Suddenly, the fog ahead of them shifted, parting just enough to reveal a new figure standing in their path. Mia froze, her breath catching in her throat. But this figure was different, taller than the faceless ones they had seen before, and it had eyes. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It was humanoid, its form eerily similar to the others, but instead of a smooth, featureless face, this one had hollow, sunken eyes. They stared at the group with an intensity that made Mia's skin crawl. There was no mouth, no nose, just those empty eyes locked on them with a focus that felt almost intelligent. "What the hell is that?" Jason muttered, stepping back, his voice filled with both awe and fear. The figure didn't move closer. Instead, it raised one pale hand and pointed toward a building at the edge of the street. The others followed its gesture, their eyes landing on a small, dilapidated structure that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. The door to the building was cracked open, just enough to see darkness beyond. "It wants us to go in there," Liam whispered, his voice trembling. Mia's pulse quickened. The faceless figures had always been distant, watching, waiting. But this one was different. It was guiding them, directing them toward something. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why does it want us to go in there?" The figure didn't respond, didn't even move. It just stood there, pointing, its hollow eyes boring into them with an unspoken command. They had no choice. With a deep breath, Mia stepped toward the door. Her hand hovered over the handle, the cold air biting at her skin as the fog swirled around them. She glanced back at the others, their faces pale with fear, and then back at the figure, still watching. The door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Mia's heart raced as she took a step closer, her breath shallow. Whatever was waiting for them inside, it wasn't going to be good. She pushed the door open wider, the creak echoing through the silent street, and then darkness swallowed them whole.
This is the end of the episode. Thank you for listening. If you like the story, please subscribe to our channel and check out our other stories. You can find the link to the next episode in the description below. What do you think about this episode? Let us know in the comment section below.